Congressional Testimony Reexamining the Economic Costs of Debt by L. Randall Wray. Section 6 Federal Deficits and GDP Growth Rates. The discussion above leads to the conclusion that federal deficits are largely outside the direct control of Congress. They are largely endogenously determined. As discussed, the deficit will always be at the right level to ensure the sectoral balance identity holds. This doesn't mean that policy is completely impotent, but it does mean that attempts to reduce or increase the size of the federal deficit can be thwarted by movements of the other balances. Moreover, any attempt to reduce government deficits must be analyzed in the context of the sectoral balances. If policymakers want to lower the government's deficit, which other balance do they expect to adjust? Are they advocating that the domestic private sector move toward a deficit, or are they advocating for a current account surplus? This makes a difference. Moving toward a private sector deficit would likely invite another serious financial crash. Moving toward a current account surplus will require adjustments by our trading partners. It is impossible to talk about reducing the federal budget deficit without considering one or both of these strategies. On the other hand, faster growth could reduce deficits without necessarily producing fragile finances in the domestic private sector. As we have seen, two important factors that can affect the budgetary outcome are movements of tax receipts and transfer payments, both of which are influenced by the growth rate of GDP. As growth picks up, revenue grows faster and transfer payments grow more slowly or even fall, which would together tend to reduce the size of the federal deficit. At the same time, faster growth is associated with movement of the domestic private sector balance towards smaller surpluses and even to deficits. However, this is attenuated by growth of imports relative to exports, which moves the current account balance toward bigger deficits. In this case, the fall of the federal budget deficit would equal the sum of the reduction of the domestic private surplus less the increase of the current account deficit. This would be strictly true only if there were no impact on state and local government balances. But generally faster growth increases their surpluses as revenues rise and some transfers fall, so that the reduction of the federal budget deficit would be somewhat smaller. Slower growth of GDP would affect the federal budget outcome in the opposite direction, generally increasing the deficit. This is likely to increase the government debt ratio for two reasons. Deficits add to outstanding debt, and if the debt grows faster when GDP grows more slowly, that will boost the debt ratio. If faster growth is accompanied by reduction of the federal deficit, and reduction of the private sector surplus, this doesn't necessarily put the private sector in a more financially precarious situation. For example, if private sector income is growing robustly, its ability to service debt will be growing. Even if its surplus or saving is diminished, it may still be in a safe financial position. This would be a good way to lower the deficit. On the other hand, if the private sector's surplus declined along with a reduction of the budget deficit in a period of slow growth, that would be a bad way to lower the deficit, as servicing private debt could be difficult. Moreover, as I have argued, the deficit itself is not an entirely discretionary variable. Congress can decide to spend less or more, and to raise or lower tax rates, but the impact on the deficit and the debt ratio is not under direct control. For example, attempts to lower the deficit could be counterproductive, as they could lower the rate of growth of GDP and thus increase the budget deficit as private sector spending declines. On the other hand, while it is usually believed that a large increase of government spending, say a fiscal stimulus package or spending for a Green New Deal initiative, would increase the deficit and lead to a larger debt ratio, the actual budgetary outcome will depend in complex ways on the impact on economic growth, as well as on how the other two main sectors respond to such changes. Figure 8 plots the combination of the deficit to GDP ratio and the rate of GDP growth by year. What the data show is that there is no determinate relation between deficits and economic growth. We can hypothesize that there are two paths to large deficits, the good way and the bad way. The good way would be a discretionary boost to aggregate demand through either a spending increase or a tax cut. While a deficit would be created, this would boost economic growth. The increase of the deficit could be temporary, as faster growth would raise tax revenue and some kind of transfer spending would fall. Keynesians argue that this can happen through multiplier impacts set off by fiscal stimulus that can pay for itself through growth of demand. Supply-siders use the Laffer curve to explain that tax cuts can stimulate the supply side and generate the revenue to pay for themselves. However, deficits can also be created in the bad way. Slow growth reduces tax receipts and increases some kinds of transfer spending. What this means is that we can achieve the same deficit ratio in either the good way or the bad way. And what will be different is the growth rate. We can hypothesize that each deficit ratio outcome is associated with at least two different growth rates, as the following curve shows. Assume the economy is at point A, say a 3% deficit ratio and a 4% rate of growth. Now let us suppose that government imposes a new consumption tax or cuts spending, reducing the growth rate. The economy moves up and to the left toward point B, a budget deficit of 10% as growth collapses, turning negative, and the deficit ratio rises. Even though the tax rate has risen, revenue falls because the recession scares households and firms, which reduce spending in an effort to build up savings. Footnote 8. This sounds similar to the Laffer curve's prediction. If the tax rate is already above the optimal rate, raising taxes reduces revenue. However, Arthur Laffer relied on supply-side effects, while I rely on demand-side effects. End footnote. That allows total revenue to fall even if consumption taxes, both rates and even revenue from the consumption tax, do rise. Footnote 9. The new tax might raise more revenue even as the economy slows, but total tax take could still fall as income taxes, etc., fall. End footnote. We will come to rest where the higher government deficit equals the higher non-government sector's desired surplus. This is in line with the sectoral balance approach discussed previously. The sum of the balances across sectors is 0. If, for example, we begin at point A with a budget deficit of 3% and a current account deficit of 2%, the domestic private sector's balance is a surplus of 1%. However, as the economy slows, moving toward point B, the slower growth also reduces imports, so the current account improves somewhat. From the sectoral balance perspective, the government's balance moves further into deficit to, say, a 9% fiscal deficit. The current account deficit falls, say, from 2% to 1%, and the private sector surplus grows to 8%, the sum of the other two balances. That's the ugly way to increase a fiscal deficit. Footnote 10. While it is beyond the scope of this paper to discuss the case of Japan, this seems to be the typical path of its deficit. The government engages in a fiscal stimulus as the economy slows, but withdraws it quickly as the economy seems to recover, slowing growth and increasing the budget deficit. The result has been 3 decades of stagnant growth and a government debt to GDP ratio of over 230%. For more on Japan, see Wray 2019b. End footnote. What is the good path to bigger deficits? Measured and targeted stimulus, spending increase or tax reduction, designed to restore confidence of firms and households. In that case, we move along the curve from point A toward point C. As the fiscal deficit increases, growth improves. Note, however, that the deficit boost will probably be temporary. As government spending rises, households and firms find their incomes rising, generating larger budget surpluses for them. Eventually, their expectations become more optimistic, and they increase discretionary spending, so their surpluses will fall. Tax revenues will increase, not because rates rise, but because income increases. We will observe that the fiscal deficit falls as the domestic private surpluses decline. The current account surplus will fall too, as imports rise. Precisely how much the deficit will fall depends on the movement of the private surplus and current account surplus, with the deficit falling to equality with the sum of the domestic and foreign balances. In the graph above, the curve shifts to the right. The new point D will be consistent with higher growth for a given deficit ratio compared to the original point A. There's nothing natural about the deficit ratio at point A. It depends on the other two sectoral balances. In other words, the deficit ratio is always at just the right level to balance the other two sectoral balances. It makes no sense to speak of the government's balance without reference to the other two balances. And it is better to focus on economic growth rather than the deficit ratio, as a high deficit can be reached with both a reduction of stimulus or an addition of ramped up stimulus.